My boss thought he buried me quietly. No fight. No noise. Just gone. What he didn't know was that the moment he fired me, he handed me the perfect weapon. And months later, while he was sipping champagne in a luxury hotel overseas, his career was already dead. If you've ever been betrayed by someone above you, if you've ever been punished for doing the right thing, or if you've ever imagined what real, calculated revenge looks like, hit like, subscribe, and buckle up. Because this isn't a story about rage. This is a story about patience, precision, and consequences. This happened in the mid-1990s. Back when corporate America still ran on fax machines, FedEx envelopes, dial-up modems, and voicemail messages that erased themselves after you listened twice. No Slack. No email chains. No digital paper trails that could be searched in seconds. If someone wanted to hide something back then, they could, especially if they were smart enough. I was young, ambitious, and working as a regional sales manager for a major consumer brand. Grocery chains. 11 Western states. I worked out of a home office on the West Coast, while my division operated out of Chicago. It was a high-pressure job, but I was good at it. Not flashy. Not political. Just effective. I hit my numbers. I stayed under budget. And when markets struggled, they sent me in to fix them. More often than not, I did. I believed, naively, that competence protected you. Back then, we had something called market development funds. MDF. Officially, it was marketing money. Unofficially, it was a corporate slush fund straight out of Mad Men. 2% of annual gross sales. Use it or lose it. No rollover. And as long as you had receipts and your boss didn't ask too many questions, or specifically ask not to know, you could spend it on almost anything. Luxury dinners, sporting events, market research trips. I once took 6 grocery executives fishing in Mexico for a weekend and nobody blinked. I wasn't greedy with it. I usually had money left over. When that happened, I'd tell my boss, let's call him Sasquatch. That wasn't his real name, but it fit. Big presence. Big ego. Loud voice. Bigger appetite, for attention, for luxury, for admiration. Sasquatch loved 2 things above all else, golf and expensive watches. Not casually. Obsessively. He talked about them nonstop. Watched pro golf religiously. Knew every Swiss watch brand, every complication, every limited release. He didn't just like status, he needed it. At the time, I didn't realize that obsession would eventually be his undoing. Near the end of the fiscal year, something strange started happening. In my weekly FedEx packet from headquarters, thick envelopes filled with paperwork, I noticed payment approvals for a demo company I'd never heard of. Demo companies handled in-store product sampling. But this one wasn't on my vendor list. Not local. Not regional. Not anywhere. I called the broker in that market. He'd never heard of them either. That's when my stomach tightened. Eventually, I traced the approvals back to Sasquatch. He had slipped them into my batch of sign-offs. I called him directly and asked, calmly, if he knew what these were. He laughed it off. Told me they should just come out of my MDF and not to worry about it. That it was handled. It was unusual. Demos didn't work that way. But he was my boss. And in that era, questioning authority didn't get you medals, it got you noticed. So I signed. 3 months later, I was called into headquarters. No warning. No explanation. Just a meeting. They told me I was being transferred to a market I'd never worked before. And I'd have to relocate to the southeast. Immediately. No negotiation. At the time, my wife was pregnant. We had just bought a house and were knee-deep in a major remodel. The relocation benefits didn't matter. Our life was here. I declined. They told me I could either find another position internally or take a severance package. I walked out unemployed. No anger yet. Just confusion. The kind that makes your ears ring and your chest feel hollow. None of it made sense. My numbers were solid. My costs were clean. My reviews were strong. Then the truth surfaced. Months later. An old coworker called me. Quietly. Carefully. Told me my region had been handed to one of Sasquatch's old associates. Someone from his previous city. Someone completely unqualified. Sales were collapsing. That's when it hit me. I hadn't been transferred. I'd been erased. And the reason was buried in those demo invoices. After digging, slow, painful digging, the kind you did before Google, I uncovered the truth. That demo company billing my MDF. It was nothing but a P.O. box, a phone line, and a DBA registered by the very person who replaced me. Later, I learned the real detail. She wasn't just his associate. She was his mistress. My chest burned when I found out. Not explosive anger. Something colder. He had stolen money, framed me for it, removed me as a liability, and installed someone loyal who would never question him. That's when revenge stopped being a fantasy and became a plan. Losing the job didn't hurt immediately. Shock has a way of numbing you before the pain arrives. At first, I told myself it was just business. Corporate restructuring. Bad timing. Wrong place, wrong moment. I focused on practical things, health insurance, severance math, unfinished drywall in the house, my wife's pregnancy appointments. Survival mode doesn't leave much room for rage. But at night, when the house went quiet and the dial-up modem stopped screeching, the thoughts crept in. They replayed conversations I couldn't rewind. Meetings I wasn't invited to. Decisions made without me in rooms I'd never enter again. And slowly, a realization settled into my bones. I hadn't been fired because I failed. I'd been fired because I accidentally saw something I wasn't supposed to see. That realization changes a man. What Sasquatch had done wasn't just unethical. It wasn't even just theft. It was surgical betrayal. He didn't scream. He didn't threaten. He didn't confront me. He smiled, shook my hand, thanked me for being a team player, then quietly maneuvered me out of the way. Like a loose floorboard that creaked too loudly. He protected himself by destroying my stability at the worst possible moment of my life. I thought about reporting him. Of course I did. I imagined walking into HR, laying out the facts, presenting the paper trail. But reality intruded quickly. I was a former employee. A disgruntled one, by definition. The invoices had my approval signature. The MDF was discretionary. And Sasquatch. He was still employed, still producing numbers, still valuable. Corporations don't pursue justice. They pursue risk mitigation. And I was risk. If I complained, the best case scenario was a quiet internal audit that went nowhere. Worst case, I'd be blacklisted in the industry. Word traveled fast even before LinkedIn existed. That was the moment something hardened inside me. I stopped wanting vindication. I stopped wanting apologies. I wanted balance. People like Sasquatch thrive because consequences never arrive. They operate in the gray zones. The bureaucratic shadows where accountability dissolves. They ruin lives and sleep soundly because no one ever pushes back hard enough. And I realized something deeply uncomfortable but undeniably true. If I walked away quietly, he would do it again. And again. And again. That thought bothered me more than my own loss. Revenge didn't come to me as anger. It arrived as clarity. I wasn't going to confront him. I wasn't going to threaten him. I wasn't going to expose him directly. That would be sloppy. Emotional. Predictable. No, if this was going to happen, it had to look like life itself turning against him. Natural. Plausible. I wanted him undone by his own choices. That's when I remembered my first year out of college. Before sales. Before territories and quotas. I'd worked briefly for an elite executive headhunting firm. The kind that didn't advertise. Retained searches only. Six-figure placements. Confidential calls. International clients. Back then, I was just a junior cog, but I learned the choreography. The cadence of authority. The language recruiters used to signal legitimacy without ever overselling. I learned how confidence, not credentials, closed the deal. And most importantly, I learned one iron rule of every successful con. The mark convinces himself. Sasquatch was already primed. His ego was enormous. His obsessions were well known. Watches. Golf. Status. Recognition. He didn't just want success, he wanted to be admired by people he believed were above him. European luxury brands. Swiss craftsmanship. Old money prestige. If an opportunity appeared that touched those nerves, he wouldn't question it. He'd lean into it. Slowly. Carefully. I didn't rush. I waited. I watched. I gathered names, habits, schedules. Back then, this wasn't as easy as clicking profiles online. It meant phone calls. Industry gossip. Trade publications. Notes scribbled on yellow legal pads. I built a psychological profile, not of a villain, but of a man desperate to believe he deserved more than he had. And here's the part people don't like admitting: revenge requires discipline. If you act too soon, you reveal yourself. If you act too loudly, you become the villain. I told myself one thing repeatedly: this was not about hurting him. This was about letting him step into a hole he'd already dug. The plan began forming not as a strike, but as a story. A story he would want to believe. A story that aligned perfectly with his self-image. I wasn't going to invent temptation. I was going to mirror his dreams back to him with just enough polish to make them irresistible. I reached out to old contacts. Overseas friends. People who owed favors. I didn't tell them everything. You never do. You only give each person the piece they need to play their role. Convincingly. Accents. Fax headers. Letterheads. Telex references. Back then, those details mattered. They were proof. By the time the outline was complete, I felt something I hadn't felt since losing my job. Control. Not chaos. Not rage. Control. Sasquatch thought he'd won. Thought the story was over. Thought I'd fade into obscurity like every other disposable middle manager. He had no idea the story had just entered its second act. Once the decision was made, everything slowed down. That's the strange thing about revenge. When it's done properly, it doesn't feel frantic. It feels deliberate. Calm. Almost clinical. I stopped fantasizing about outcomes and started focusing on process. Because if there was one thing I remembered from my brief time in elite executive recruiting, it was this: people don't respond to opportunities. They respond to narratives that validate how they already see themselves. Sasquatch didn't see himself as a middle manager skimming money from MDF accounts. He saw himself as a misunderstood executive trapped in a company that didn't fully appreciate his talents, his taste, his connections. In his mind, he wasn't stealing, he was supplementing what he believed he was owed. That internal justification was the crack I planned to widen. The first step was distance. You can't lure someone with revenge if they suspect proximity. I needed to be invisible. Untethered. A voice from somewhere else. Somewhere important. Somewhere old world and prestigious. Switzerland wasn't just a country to Sasquatch, it was a shrine. Watches. Precision. Heritage. Luxury that whispered instead of shouted. If temptation was a language, Switzerland was his native tongue. I reached out to an old friend in the UK who actually worked in executive recruiting. Not a favor seeker. A professional. Someone who understood cadence, restraint, and credibility. I didn't tell him it was revenge. I framed it as a social experiment. A hypothetical. A curiosity about how far perceived opportunity could carry someone. He laughed, agreed, and played his part perfectly. A clipped English accent does half the work before a single word lands. Next came the infrastructure. This wasn't the internet age. You couldn't just spin up a website and LinkedIn page overnight. Legitimacy had weight back then. It arrived in envelopes. In paper quality. In letterhead alignment. In fax headers that looked like they came from machines that cost more than a used car. I cobbled together a recruiting firm name that sounded ancient and discreet. No flashy claims. No exaggeration. Just quiet authority. Then came the watch company. I didn't invent a brand. That would have been sloppy. I referenced a real Swiss manufacturer, one known in elite circles for limited production runs and aggressive sports sponsorships. The genius of using a real entity is that people stop questioning once. Recognition triggers familiarity. Sasquatch didn't need proof. He needed permission to believe. The job description was crafted like a love letter to his ego. Not sales. Not management. Ambassador. Hospitality liaison. Strategic partnerships. Words that meant access without accountability. The role centered around professional golf sponsorships. International tournaments. High net worth client experiences. It included a six-figure salary, unrestricted travel budget. First-class flights, luxury accommodations. Discretionary entertainment funds. And, this was the clincher, preferential access to rare and limited edition watches at internal cost. When my friend made the first call, he didn't pitch. He probed. Asked about Sasquatch's career. His interests. His frustrations. And Sasquatch, predictably, talked. At length. About golf. About watches. About how American corporations didn't understand refinement. The more he spoke, the more the hook sank in, not because of what was offered, but because someone important was finally listening. Over the next several weeks, the courtship continued slowly. No urgency. No pressure. That's how you know something is real, right? There were follow-up calls. Carefully worded faxes. Confidential, stamped in places designed to be noticed. Each interaction reinforced the idea that this opportunity wasn't being sold. It was being selectively extended. Sasquatch started rearranging his internal hierarchy without realizing it. His current job became something he endured, while waiting for his real life to begin. That's the danger zone. That's when people make mistakes. He asked questions about timelines. About relocation. About tax implications. All answered smoothly. Professionally. With just enough ambiguity to feel authentic. Then came the hook with teeth. The recruiter informed him that the final step required an in-person meeting at corporate headquarters in Switzerland. Final approval, final alignment. Onboarding logistics, no written offer until that meeting. Standard procedure for roles at that level. Sasquatch barely hesitated. Of course it required travel. Of course it was exclusive. That's how important jobs worked. Or at least how he believed they worked. But there was a problem. The proposed dates overlapped directly with mandatory divisional meetings back in the States. Meetings Sasquatch absolutely could not miss without drawing attention. He expressed concern, real concern. The kind that briefly cracks confidence. And that's when the recruiter did what good recruiters do, offered a compromise that sounded like a favor. The meeting could be moved up a few days. However, due to short notice, Sasquatch would need to book his own unrestricted business class ticket and hotel accommodations. Reimbursement would follow once onboarding was complete. Save your receipts, he was told. That phrase carries an incredible amount of authority. It signals inevitability. You don't save receipts unless the outcome is assured. Sasquatch booked everything himself. Expensive flight, luxury hotel suite. No expense spared because in his mind, this wasn't spending, it was investing in the life he deserved. He flew out believing he was stepping into the final act of a long overdue promotion. That by the following week, he'd be untouchable. When he arrived at the hotel, jet-lagged but euphoric, there was a note waiting for him. The meeting had to be rescheduled. A corporate emergency. Board level. Unavoidable. Apologies flowed. Reassurances followed. The new meeting would be the following Monday. Just a few days later, plenty of time. The recruiter even suggested he enjoy Europe for the weekend. Unwind. Celebrate quietly. Because by Monday, everything would change. Sasquatch panicked about the meetings he was missing back home. Called the recruiter in a sweat. What if this damaged his standing? What if someone noticed? That's when the final nudge came. He was told, gently, that calling in sick was reasonable. That these things happen and that frankly, his current employer would soon be irrelevant anyway. He agreed from that moment on. The outcome was inevitable. Because while Sasquatch was wandering Europe, convinced he was ascending, I made one phone call and that phone call would end everything. While Sasquatch believed he was days away from stepping into the life he'd always felt entitled to, I was sitting in a quiet room with a phone in my hand, steadying my breathing. This was the most dangerous moment of the entire plan. Everything hinged on sounding casual. Forgettable. Like an administrative error that would be brushed aside if it didn't matter, or explode if it did. I didn't call human resources first. That would have been suspicious. HR exists to protect companies, not answer questions. I called higher. I called the president of the division. The men Sasquatch reported to. The men who signed off on budgets, leadership roles, and executive trust. I introduced myself as someone from an international recruiting firm and apologized immediately. As if I'd already made a mistake. That tone matters. People forgive mistakes far more readily than confidence. I asked for a quick reference. Nothing formal. Just confirmation of Sasquatch's employment dates and general work ethic. You'd be shocked how often this happens, especially in senior-level recruiting. Executives expect to be poached. It flatters them. It lowers defenses. There was a pause. Not long. Just long enough. The president didn't confirm anything. He didn't deny anything either. Instead, he did exactly what seasoned corporate operators do when something smells wrong. He redirected. He said references had to go through HR, polite, neutral, but attentive. I thanked him and, just before hanging up, let one more detail slip. Casually. Almost apologetically. I mentioned that Sasquatch was currently in Europe, finalizing his transition and that I assumed formal notice had already been given. My mistake, I said. I hated bothering him. That was it. No accusations. No claims. No demands. Just information placed gently into the wrong place at the wrong time. Information that could not be unheard. When I hung up the phone, my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the realization that I had just lit a fuse I could no longer control. From that moment on, everything happened without me. That's the part people misunderstand about revenge at this level. Once you trigger the system, you step back. Corporations don't rage. They don't shout. They investigate quietly, methodically, and with ruthless efficiency. Somewhere inside that building, questions started forming. Where was Sasquatch? Why was he unreachable? Why hadn't notice been filed? Why were divisional meetings being missed? Meanwhile, Sasquatch was in Europe, checking his voicemail obsessively, watching hours tick by with no updates. Every unanswered call deepened the pit in his stomach. He faxed messages. He left voicemails. He contacted the recruiter. Nothing. Silence. Silence is unbearable to people who live on validation. It strips them of control. Monday came and went. No meeting. No offer. No explanation. At this point, panic would have set in physically. Cold sweat. shallow breathing. The mental math of credit card balances, missed meetings. And the terrifying possibility that the dream job might not exist. But it was already too late. Because back home, the company had made its decision. They didn't wait for him. They didn't call him. They packed his office. Quietly. Efficiently. No spectacle. His personal items boxed. His computer wiped. His access revoked. Corporate doesn't fire executives in hallways, they erase them from systems. By the time Sasquatch boarded his flight home, his badge no longer worked anywhere. When he landed, jet-lagged and exhausted, he didn't drive to the office. He was instructed to meet an HR representative off-site. Neutral ground. That alone tells you everything. No confrontation. No explanations offered beyond what was legally required. He was handed severance papers. Asked for company property. The car keys. The credit cards. The phone. He was no longer an employee. I learned later, through whispers. Through old contacts. Still in the industry, that internal audits had already uncovered the MDF irregularities. The demo company. The P.O. box. The paper trail he assumed was invisible. Once scrutiny began, everything collapsed under its own weight. His mistress was terminated for theft. His reputation followed him. The industry is smaller than people think. Certain doors close quietly and never reopen. The personal fallout came later. His wife left him. Or maybe she already knew and this was just the final confirmation. Either way, the life he flaunted unraveled quickly. Status is fragile when it isn't earned. The watches. The golf trips. The admiration. All gone. And the cruel irony was that he never knew why. Never knew who. Never knew that the men he discarded had simply let gravity do the work. As for the money, I heard he spent at least $10,000 on travel, hotels, and expenses. A small price compared to what he took from me, but symbolic. Pain feels different when it comes from your own decisions. I didn't feel joy when I heard the aftermath. I felt something quieter. Balance. For a long time after it was over. I didn't feel the rush people expect from revenge stories. There was no fist pump. No triumphant laughter. No moment where I leaned back and thought, that showed him. What I felt instead was something closer to emotional decompression. Like a pressure valve finally releasing after being sealed too tight for too long. The constant low-level tension I'd been carrying since the day I lost my job slowly faded. I slept better. I breathed easier. My thoughts stopped looping back to unanswered questions. That's how I knew it had worked. Not because Sasquatch suffered, but because I stopped suffering. I never revealed myself to him. Not through an anonymous letter. Not through a mutual contact. Not even years later. Some people think revenge requires confession. That the antagonist has to know who delivered the blow for it to be satisfying. I disagree. Knowledge would have served him, not me. It would have given him something to rage against, someone to blame. Some external villain to rewrite his own story around. Silence denied him that comfort. Silence forced him to sit alone with the consequences of his choices. And make no mistake, those consequences followed him. In corporate America, people don't get officially blacklisted. There's no document. No announcement. But there are phone calls that don't get returned. Recruiters who suddenly lose the role. Interviews that never make it past the first round. A quiet reputation as someone who can't be trusted with money or discretion. Once that label attaches itself, it doesn't come off. Not in that era. Not in that industry. The mistress was fired. The marriage collapsed. The lifestyle evaporated. All the things he valued, status, access, admiration, proved to be conditional. Temporary. Built on sand. And when the tide went out, there was nothing underneath. People sometimes ask me if I regret it. That question always surprises me. Because it assumes regret should come from restoring balance. What I regret is trusting someone who showed me exactly Who he was long before I paid the price. What I regret is believing that playing fair protects you from people who don't. Revenge didn't create damage, it revealed it. Everything that happened to Sasquatch was already latent. I didn't invent his downfall. I simply stopped shielding him from gravity. There's a popular phrase people love to repeat: living well is the best revenge. And as I've gotten older, I understand the sentiment behind it. Moving on matters. Healing matters. Building a good life matters. But that phrase is incomplete. It only works after accountability exists. Without consequences, living well becomes surrender. It becomes permission for predators to continue unchallenged. Some offenses demand more than forgiveness. Some betrayals demand correction. I'm not proud of everything I've ever planned. Not all revenge ideas are good ideas. Some backfire. Some poison the person who carries them. Revenge done recklessly is just self-harm with extra steps. But revenge done patiently, proportionally, and surgically can restore something essential that gets stolen when injustice goes unanswered. Self-respect. There's an old phrase from Sicily, Sicilian Alzheimer's. It means you never forget an offense. Not out of bitterness, but out of memory. Awareness. Survival. I don't dwell on what Sasquatch did anymore. But I remember it. Because remembering teaches you who deserves access to your trust. And who never should again. This all happened before the internet. Before social media, before doxing. Before digital footprints made every lie fragile. Today, people assume everything is a scam because scams are louder now. Back then, confidence was the currency. And Sasquatch had spent his entire career projecting it while quietly hollowing himself out from the inside. That's why the con worked. Not because it was clever, but because it aligned perfectly with who he already believed he was. Revenge isn't clean. It isn't holy. And it isn't always satisfying in the way movies promise. Sometimes it feels heavy. Sometimes it feels uncomfortable. Sometimes you question yourself afterward. But there are moments in life when walking away teaches the wrong lesson. To you and to the person who hurt you. This was one of those moments. I didn't destroy a man. I stopped protecting a thief. And when protection vanished, the truth finished the job. That was enough. If this story kept you listening, hit that like button. If you believe some people earn their consequences, subscribe for more real, calculated revenge stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, have you ever seen someone undone by their own arrogance? Or quietly get exactly what they deserved? Because sometimes karma doesn't need help. It just needs timing.